All right. Well, with that, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody. We're here to talk more about the portfolio application requirement for the Master of Arts in Design Engineering program at Brown. We've got a lot of great information about the program to share with you, as well as some tips for submitting your portfolio and about the application process. So, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll do some introductions. I'll start since I'm already talking. My name is Victoria Bray. I'm the Associate Director of Recruitment with the Division of Masters and Professional Programs. And I work with all of our School of Engineering prospective students and applicants to learn more about Brown and the application process. And I'll hand things over to Rich if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Rich Morales. I'm professor at Brown. I'm the co-director of this really fascinating program that blends two powerful schools with two different perspectives and look forward to taking your questions. I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
Jonathan Knowles, Professor of Architecture at Rhode Island School of Design and co-director with Rich. Second year at the program. Looking forward to building a really strong cohort for this coming year. Tori.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Tori Riccitelli, and I'm the MAID program specialist in the School of Engineering. I support the MAID program, all the students and the faculty, and just deal with the day-to-day operations.
And finally, Griffin.
Hi everybody. I'm Griffin Van Horn. I'm the maker in residence and a technical instructor with the MAID program. I work with digital prototyping, electronics prototyping, design for manufacturing. So I work closely with the students throughout throughout your time in MAID, and I like to say that I help bring projects to life.
Great, fantastic. So lots of people to ask questions to today. We'll be here for probably the full hour with questions and things like that. But what we're going to cover in the presentation portion, we're going to talk briefly about the program. We'll talk in depth about portfolio best practices along with some examples. And then we will talk through the application process to the program. If you have questions, we would love to answer them. Your questions really drive this conversation, so please feel free to use the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll answer questions throughout the session. We'll also save some for the end if we feel like they'll be better used for the group. With that, I think we can go ahead and get started.
So many of you hopefully have been to the other two info sessions, so this is a little bit of a repeat. But as you know, it's a joint degree between Brown University School of Engineering and Rhode Island School of Design Division of Architecture and Design. So it's a joint one-year degree from June through June, basically, or July through June. 11 months intensive, summer, fall, spring. And the benefit of the program is you get the best of both worlds. Shared resources between Brown University, as well as the studio and art culture here at RISD. Next.
One of the, in addition to coming up and hanging out in a very creative space with two different universities, is you get the faculty from those two different universities, again, with a different perspective. This slide just highlights the different disciplines that come. Jonathan's an architect. I'm a systems engineer. Griffin, also on this call, is a specialist, has founded his own company, is also doing entrepreneurial work. Tori has been here for quite some time and understands exactly how to better support your needs. And you can see everything from industrial design, which is RISD, through AI, game design, entrepreneurship, drawing, and I'm biased, I think is the best faculty from both programs. Last is not only are the disciplines different, but the place where they put their experience is both public, private, and nonprofit, which I think is uniquely RISD and Brown flavored. Slide. This is the profile. If you're somebody like me, awfully young, right? But this young cohort has a lot of good experience, whether it be at some of the nation's top best design schools, or if they have work experience. We think that there's a powerful component of international dimension, and the cohort size is about 25, might grow by a little bit, but not by a lot. And they're terrific.
Awesome. I can take over. We'll talk a bit about some tips for crafting your portfolio. We'll be fairly brief, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So what is a portfolio? It's an illustration of your work. You're documenting some of your highlights of past projects you've worked on. It's a requirement of the admissions process. So we review your portfolio alongside your transcript and your CV and the rest of your materials. Um, it's a really good demonstration of it's the clearest way that we can see who you are as a designer or engineer. You can tell your story through your work. So it's a really great place to put some additional effort in and make sure that you're putting your best foot forward in showing us how you think about problems and how you address them. What if I don't have a design or engineering background? Show us who you are. Tell the story of what technical skills and what you bring to the table, what your unique lens is. We're definitely looking for applicants that have design and engineering backgrounds, but we understand that people have a variety of backgrounds and still have a lot of design and engineering expertise. So yeah, show us who you are. Mechanics of a strong portfolio, 7 to 10 pages max. That is a hard cutoff. Please do not submit a 20-page portfolio. We will read the first 10 pages. Highlight 3 or 4 projects. Don't try to cram as many in as you can. Really tell the story of 3 to 4 core projects. That means each project will have multiple pages. It might be a bit different than other formats that you're used to, but that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that kind of demonstration of your process. PDF format, not a web portfolio, not a video portfolio, and that's submitted through the portal where you submit the rest of your application materials. Images strongly encouraged. Videos, I think that might be outdated. You can include a link to a video, but do not expect us to watch that. Everything should be demonstrated through the PDF. But if you do want to include additional materials, then you are able to do that, but assume that that's supplementary and won't necessarily be viewed. So make sure everything is conveyed through the PDF itself. Same thing with the personal website. Everything should be embedded in that portfolio. You're free to add a link, but expect that just the PDF itself will be viewed.
This last point's important.
Yeah, very important. And I'm going to touch on this again in the next slide, but give credit where credit is due. MADE is a highly collaborative program. A lot of the projects that you'll be working on in MADE are collaborative projects. I think that's different than a group project. This is, an intentionally interdisciplinary cohort where you're leveraging the skills of everybody else in the room to achieve a goal. We want to see demonstration that you're capable of collaborating. And I noticed that some people really kind of try to highlight individual projects to show off what they can do specifically, but there is a benefit to showing off that you can work well with others and that you can work with somebody from a different background and focus on what you're good at and highlight what they're good at and be very clear about what you contributed, what they contributed, and how you guys collaborated. I think there's a big benefit to that. It's just the important thing is being clear about who did what. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so knowing your audience, knowing that we are our professors, we are people who have a fair understanding of what we're looking at. So you can kind of shape your narrative around not necessarily a general audience, but trying to demonstrate your understanding. I can talk a bit about what that might look like on a technical level in a couple of slides. Um, Tell us the story. There are a million problems in this world. Why did you choose to address the one that you're targeting with this project? Show us, why you identified this problem and how you went about tackling it, then what the outcome was. Think about this like an arc. You have 2 to 3 pages for each project. How did you collaborate with others? Important to repeat. That's part of the story is I'm really good at this, but I might, I could try to learn this myself, but I know this person who's excellent at that. So we put our heads together and we went farther than we could alone. That's awesome. That's what we try to teach here. Um, and what were those results? Don't just show a picture, this beautiful picture of your polished thing or a rendering. Tell us show us what it is, how it works, what you learned from it, what you do differently. Demonstrate your depth of thought. And why made? I think it's really helpful to say, look at what I can do. I'm pushing myself. I'm engineering focused, but I clearly have a passion for design, and you can see that in my portfolio. But with coming to Made, I can push that even further. And I can leverage what I'm really good at, and I can grow in skills that I want to continue to develop. So how does demonstrate that you're walking the walk, not just talking the talk, that you're pushing yourself in this direction, and why Made is going to propel you forward towards your goals, but kind of demonstrate like I say I want to work on biomaterials. You can see that I'm pushing in this direction. There's if we see some like misalignment between what you say you want to do on paper and then what are demonstrating in your application, then then we notice that misalignment. And why now? That's the kind of the same part of that of like, is it clear that this is the right time to do that based on, I'm pushing myself in this direction, and if I come now, then this can really propel me. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, simplicity is key. Focus on the core text that demonstrates your point, but don't just overwhelm us with text. Clean layout, easy to navigate. Just think about how you would read a page, what makes sense to scan visually. Your general profile, where you're based, what you've done before. I mean, a lot of that stuff is captured in the rest of your application, but it's helpful to just give a brief overview of it. Clean headings. Yeah, 3 to 4 projects, 7 to 10 pages. Prioritize your best work, and try to have your work support the narrative of who you're saying you are, who you're demonstrating you are, rather than, I'm an engineer, here 10 engineering projects, and then I'm going to cram in, three pages of paintings that I've done, on the last pages. Yeah, standard structure, repeating sections, having, a clear, making it helpful for the readers to understand, okay, this is a new project. The skills that I'm focusing on are going to be in the same place for every project that I'm showing. And yeah, how it solves the problem, what the realized outcome of the project is this, we created this thing, look how beautiful it is, or is this, we created this thing and we put it in the hands of a user or we submitted it to a design competition, or demonstrate what the outcome of that project was. And yeah, the takeaways: demonstrate your depth of thought. Say, it's helpful to say, this is what I learned from this. This is what I would do differently. That's what we push you to do through iteration. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, these are some additional points. Be clear. This is just as important as the collaboration. Be clear if this thing is if what you're showing in your portfolio is a looks like prototype, where it's maybe a 3D printed hollow shell of what the final product would look like, or a Figma click through template of an app, or is this a works like prototype? Does this have all the electronics embedded inside of it and it's fully functional, or it's an app on the App Store? Be clear about that. There's no problem with having a looks like prototype, but the problem is having that and saying, look, it works. It's fully functional, but it's not actually. So it's if there's any vagueness to it, then it kind of casts doubt in the mind of the reviewer of, does this really work? This is amazing if it works, but it's unclear that it does. So being clear about that is very important. Because it just makes it explicit for the reader. Demonstrate your understanding. This is understand who the reviewers are. Know your audience. If you're saying, I worked on Arduino, I'm pushing myself to work on Arduino, don't just show a picture of a messy breadboard, which is a very common thing when people say, I'm working on electronics. Show a wiring diagram. Show us that you understand what's actually happening, rather than this picture where it might be impressive to somebody who has not worked with Arduino, but a reviewer who has, that is going to indicate that it's not actually conveying any useful information about the functionality of the project. So demonstrate your technical understanding through the images that you include. Illustrate your story. Don't just show the final product. Don't just show that glossy final image. Show us the prototyping steps that you did. Show us the work in progress that shows us how you're working, how you're iterating, what methods you're using. Highlight problem solving. I say this to current MADE students all the time. Always be documenting. Don't just show the things that go well. Show what went wrong and how you overcame it. One of the hardest things to do is when something goes wrong is to take out your camera and take a picture of it. But it's incredibly helpful to tell the full arc of the story and say, we didn't make it, we didn't make this joint thick enough and the thing broke. And so now we know, but that's a valuable data, and we can go from there. And then again, collaboration is key. If it's fine to have worked on only solo projects, but if you do have collaborative projects, that's super beneficial to include, to demonstrate that and to be clear about who contributed what. But yeah, as you can see, collaboration, we've now talked about it 3 times. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, these are just some very basic examples. Everybody's portfolio is going to look different. If you're coming from an engineering degree, we're not expecting you to have, to have an incredibly polished portfolio. Obviously, do the absolute best you can, but we see if you have, UI UX designer on your application or mechanical engineering, and we're going to, weigh the fidelity of your portfolio differently. So these are just some rough guidelines, but everybody's is going to look very different. So here are just some examples of very clear or very clean portfolio structures. We'll just kind of breeze through these. You can just kind of see very basic renderings in these these initial pictures. We can go to the next slide. A few more here. You can see some more kind of thumbnail images. In this scenario, these would be kind of stages of a project rather than individual projects themselves, but a bit more dense in terms of information. You can go to the next slide, please. Here's some examples just for resources. This is from our previous executive director, included a resource for some templates and inspiration for a layout. So just kind of thinking about hierarchy of type and just kind of highlighting the key message of the project. Next slide, please. Here's some examples of portfolios from past students. This was from Dan Rappaport, who did an awesome VR 3D printing of Mars regolith project and made. Here's some examples of his portfolio and another previous student's portfolio. Next slide, please. Okay. And again, we can, just being very brief about that, mainly just kind of giving extra time for Q&A, as everybody's portfolio is going to be different and they're going to have, individual questions. So we want to make sure we can get to those.
Awesome.
There's one, sorry, Victoria, there's one question that maybe we can open it up. I'm curious as how do the candidates from backgrounds like finance, manufacturing, consulting approach their portfolios? So I think that's a very good question.
Yeah. I think manufacturing, there's kind of a clear answer for that. I think that is
part of the program.
Manufacturing engineering or design for manufacturing, that is pretty clear. Consulting, that's a broad range. You can kind of demonstrate the projects that you've consulted on and kind of what role you played in the design or engineering. Finance, I'm not sure which. I'm assuming these were previous students that you're referring to of backgrounds that we've highlighted. That would be a student that has been accepted that has a finance background, would also have designer engineering backgrounds and would be highlighting that work within their portfolio. So they might have a finance background on paper, but there's work to be included in that portfolio.
What's that, Rich?
Or tech work, right? So that you've done some engineering application that has a creative focus, or vice versa, design that's trying to. So depending on what your perceived gap is, the idea is you come out with pretty strong foundations in both design and engineering or manufacturing. But yes, finance is one of the skills. It's probably not specifically the skill we're going to lean heavily on as part of the application process.
But it does add a very unique lens of, if you do have, design or engineering work that you can demonstrate, and, that's an exciting, kind of additional flavor to add to your application.
Yeah, and I know this seems like we're making this up as we go. Like, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship. I definitely think it's exciting. I definitely think it's good. I'm not disagreeing with Griff. I'm saying that there is no one shape, form, or size of an application. You should put forth together what you think is your current skill set, what skill sets you want, and then trust us and trust you to make the case for it. Does it make sense? So Griff and I are actually saying the same thing.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. I want to talk more about the application process generally, right? Because the portfolio is just one piece of a larger application. We consider all of those pieces of the application when we're looking at your file. So, High level, let's talk through dates, deadlines, and application requirements. So our priority deadline has passed. That was December 1st. If folks on the call already applied by the priority deadline, you can expect to hear from us at some point in late January with your admission decision. Regular application deadline right around the corner, January 15th, and then you'll hear back from us in early March. Important to note, this program starts in the summer. So if you're admitted to the program, you can expect to start in early July. Talking through the application requirements, we're going to have you submit unofficial transcripts, English language proficiency exam scores if your native language is not English. We require 3 letters of recommendation. We require all 3 letters of recommendation in order for your application to be considered complete and ready for review. We cannot review incomplete applications. Of course, your portfolio, crucial part of the application, your resume or your CV, which will outline your skills, your work experience, research that you've done, really sort of you in the time that you've been in undergrad and post undergrad. Short answer questions. We're going to ask you a series of short answer questions. My biggest piece of advice here is answer the question. The admission committee and the program have crafted a list of questions with great care with the hope that you'll answer them specifically. So please don't just sort of copy and paste your personal statement into those fields. Really spend some time with it because we've created the questions with an eye towards getting these answers so that we can be reading your application for admissibility. And then you'll be asked to do a video essay. It's a prompt. You'll be asked one of a series of questions. We have a whole bunch of questions, so it's randomized. And then you'll be expected to answer that question in real time. So that's all through the application, nothing in addition that you need to do beyond moving through the application. So let's talk through some of these requirements a little bit more in depth. The transcript for the purposes of your application can be unofficial. So we can review unofficial transcripts. They should come from anywhere that you've attended after secondary school. So if you have multiple bachelor's degrees, you transferred from one institution to another, you already have a master's degree in a different field, we want to see all of those transcripts so that we can get a full picture of what your academic history looks like. If you attended an institution outside of the United States for your degrees, you do not have to submit a credential evaluation from WES ECE, the evaluation company, as a part of your application. However, once you matriculate, if you're admitted, then we'll expect you to follow up with a credential evaluation with degree conferral information, as well as an official transcripts for anybody on the call. So again, I just want to be super clear. Make sure that you're reviewing, you get an unofficial transcript, you can take a look at it, make sure that all of your grades are on there. If you are a current undergraduate student, it includes in progress coursework. All of that is really helpful for us when we're reviewing transcripts. English language proficiency exam scores, we can only take the TOEFL and the IELTS to satisfy that requirement. You are going to be required to submit English language proficiency exam scores if you do not speak English as your native language and you do not or will not have a degree from an institution where the sole language of instruction is English. So if you speak Spanish as your native language, but you have a degree from an institution in the United States, Australia, the English-speaking parts of Canada, we would not require you to submit either the TOEFL or the IELTS to satisfy that requirement. Letters of recommendation. Again, we're going to require 3 letters of recommendation in order to be able to consider your application. You should be asking folks who know you really well, who can speak to you more than just, this person got an A in my class, this person was in the top 10% of my class. They should be able to speak to you specifically how successful you'll be in a graduate program, specifically how successful you'll be in the design engineering program. So really ask folks who know you well, who've taught you in the classroom, who've worked with you on projects. Those are all really helpful people to be able to speak positively to your candidacy for the program. Make sure you make those requests early. The application deadline is right around the corner. I should say, though, that the application deadline is the submission deadline. You have up until 2 weeks after the application deadline to submit any additional materials. So if we do get letters of recommendation in, January 16th, January 17th, we'll still consider your application for review. Just make sure that you're submitting that application by the deadline. So now I think we'd like to answer some questions. I can see that folks are submitting them. You can always be in touch with us. We're happy to answer emails. I'll put my email address in the chat so people can reach out to me directly. I'm happy to help sort of find folks resources needed to make the decision to apply. That being said, I think we'll start to take some questions.
I'll take
There's
a
one. Oh, go ahead, Rich.
crack. Yeah, I was going to take a crack at a question I saw about what should you show us in your portfolio? And I think it's sort of little like what you should highlight in your application. There isn't one specific mode. The fact that we showed things that are very pictorially based. If you want to expand on methodologies you've used, on approaches you've used, sort of show the range of skills that you have, you're coming to Made to learn new skills as well. So don't feel like you've got to have a perfect portfolio. You have to have a portfolio that reflects the hard work you're able to put in. Griffin mentioned the collaboration, and there is no one form. So if we showed you a particular version, they all seem to be leaning one way. Just put in something that highlights and shows all those things I just mentioned. Hopefully that's helpful to the question that asked. And then last on the NDA, yet certainly don't tell us anything you shouldn't, but even NDAs, and I've worked with a lot of different agencies, there's ways that you can generically describe the nature of work, the approach, maybe the outcome, and the broadest you can zoom out. I'm working for a car company to design a flying, marshmallow or something. We don't know what you're doing, but you could tell us other ways. All
I
right,
was going
go
to
ahead, John.
recommend that maybe a page of the portfolio just outline those NDA related projects. And if you can show an image, great. If you can't, just a description, a basic description, as Rich said, would be important to highlight to us.
I can I think this is a great question to add some additional clarity to, or to gain some additional clarity from. How do you feel about the use of AI in a portfolio? Example, mood boards or rapid viscom renderings with the AI use appropriately called out. Is that something you like to see an application proficient in, or do you dislike seeing it? Um, I think there's a big difference between, using Canva, Figma to generate an AI generated template for your portfolio, or demonstrating, look at these images I had Dolly 2 generate for me, versus demonstrating a technical understanding of AI tools and how to best use them, and push the limits of them. I think that's an area that professors in MADE, such as Chalky, do teach, at Brown, and so demonstrating that in a way that a professor in the practice would understand and appreciate your technical ability to do that, is absolutely industry relevant. But I think being critical about, is this demonstrating that ability, or is this just showing a mood board I created in 10 minutes, I think you need to think about, is this portfolio worthy? So that's definitely, but I think in terms of like, that's a different question than using AI to generate text for your portfolio, or generate images for your portfolio without calling that out. Hopefully that's helpful. Feel free to ask follow-ups if I didn't fully understand what you're asking. Yeah, the portfolios here are mostly images, even the engineering focused ones. Is that recommended? These are from past students. These are older ones where we were kind of offering a web specific template. Definitely not definitely not recommended to go very image heavy. Definitely kind of add some text to your images that you use. Some of the important parts of the portfolio seem difficult to demonstrate via images. Absolutely. I think it's a show don't tell type of scenario, where you can absolutely minimize the amount of text that you're using, to try to visualize things, but there is a balance where you absolutely will need to use text, but somewhere in between all text and all images. Same thing with balance between under overwhelming the admissions team with too much context versus not enough information. I think um, iteration is key. Taking a stab at it, then looking back at it and thinking, is this very, very text heavy? I think you can kind of start out with a statement of the problem, and then kind of once you have additional context up front, you can kind of minimize the amount of text that you're using as you've already introduced the problem and your potential solution.
Interactive PDF, you guys? I don't think so, right?
I don't think that we'll have the ability to view that.
I don't either.
Yeah, I would not expect that that we'll have the ability to view that because it'll be embedded in an online portal. So that might not work. Don't rely on that. If it does where you have hyperlinks or GIFs, then if they do work, then that's great. But if they don't, does it still generate that but does it still convey the information? What platform do you recommend creating our portfolio on?
That's
Jonathan, do you have any software of preference?
it's tough. I mean, a lot of our students use InDesign and just lay it out.
InDesign, you can absolutely do it with Illustrator, but InDesign is optimized for this sort of thing. You can absolutely use Figma. You can get pretty good results from that, but definitely you get more advanced tools with InDesign or Illustrator. But Figma is free to the best of my knowledge. Hopefully it still is.
There's a question about letters of recommendation from volunteer roles. I want to talk a little bit about letters of recommendation. I think one thing to think through when you're asking for a letter of recommendation, it's not just, is somebody going to speak really positively about my candidacy in general? It's like, how can they speak specifically to your success in this program? If that volunteer role is related to engineering, related to design, great. But think about that when you're asking for letters of recommendation. If you're doing volunteer work that's like wholly unrelated to your master's degree, that's probably not going to be as impactful as a letter of recommendation from somebody who has experienced something related to design engineering with you, gone through a project with you, taught you in the classroom, worked with you in a professional capacity. So it's tough to answer really specific questions about who should write a letter of recommendation because some of it does have to do with, where were you volunteering? What work were you doing as a volunteer? Was it work that you were doing? I was volunteering at a homeless shelter, in a soup kitchen. That's all fantastic work. And we definitely, we put that on your resume, put that on your CV. But as far as somebody to speak to your candidacy, it should be related in some way to the program that you're applying to. Anything other folks want to add to that?
No, I think that's speaking to specific skills is essential. I think there's kind of a tendency to want to ask your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss for a recommendation, and they have an amazing title, but they can speak less specifically to what you've done, how they've seen you solve problems, how they've seen you demonstrate leadership. So that is way more powerful than asking for a recommendation from somebody who doesn't know as much about you and can't confidently speak to your skill set.
It's a question from. Oh, go ahead,
Yeah.
Rich.
I'm trying to listen carefully for your questions, and I think Jonathan Griffin have fielded them very well. I caution you all to not try to form fit yourself to someone else. That again, we don't have any specific thing. You might be. I really like what Victoria said, which is, it's not about. It's about making us see who you are. You don't have to have everything solved now. That's why you're coming here, to gain those skills. But the more authentic, the more precise you can be, without trying to have somebody that doesn't know you as well in the recommendation form, or again, the portfolio or the program. Like, don't go out and learn a program because that's what everyone else is submitting. I mean, give us what you have. And if you're light on the portfolio, then you better be strong on your other element. Go ahead, Jonathan. Sorry.
Maybe Mackenzie talks about, she has or he or she has a bunch of collaborative projects, which is great. I don't see any harm in showing all of those in your portfolio, just being clear of your contribution to each one. That's not a negative for this program.
Absolutely. How do you recommend showing coding projects? In addition to seeing the product, you also want to see the actual code. If so, what format? Um,
Hmm.
how might you demonstrate the functionality of the code, assuming that the reviewer will not be able to look at the code? So I think that trying to convey the functionality, maybe core snippets that, something that took you a long time to solve, that was a turning point in the project. But I would not, you can absolutely, I think it's great practice to include a link, a GitHub link or whatever. But, for somebody that, if they're, wow, that's really impressive, let me look at this after admissions. But I wouldn't expect, don't base the narrative of your project on an external link. Same thing for, interactive project, assuming that's a digital interactive project. That would kind of be like showing mock-ups, and demonstrating the UI UX, demonstrating the interaction design through mock-ups. You know, and I think there are plenty of examples on mockups. There are plenty of templates for how to do that. I'm assuming that's what you mean by interactive in this, based on the coding. If you're talking about physical interaction, then definitely demonstrating that in action. You can do that through images for sure.
And to answer Emma, I would say it is okay to include, if you're working on your capstone, show it. Show where you are and be very clear. That's what you're doing. I don't see a problem with that.
I also, yeah, and this is a great, like I said, be clear about looks like versus works like. There's no problem in showing both at the same time. I think that's done in industry as well, where you see this is the benchtop prototype. This is what, this is the enclosure it's going to fit into in 3 months. Here are them side by side. Saying, you don't need to just show that because it's not, in this rendered image yet. You can show this is where I'm at. Here are the two things, and in, by May, everything will be integrated. But yeah, I agree.
Victoria, did you want to add to that?
No, not necessarily. I think that really covers it. Yeah.
Okay.
Tyler, would you consider artwork as a form of design if it meets very specific needs of a community to include in the portfolio? I think that's
Yes.
design work. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely identifying that problem. I would, just think about that narrative and think about how you conveyed that. I think that framing is a big part of this, where people say, oh, I'm not a designer. I don't do this. I just made this artwork to address this need and implemented that solution. It's like, yeah, you're designing.
But it's
Um,
different than if you're just sending us your favorite attempt at Picasso, right? You better tell us why that is linked to a bigger thing. And I know you know that, Tyler. So again, I sound like a broken record, and maybe I'm adding less value. Don't put so much pressure on yourself. I think there is value to linking it to what the core objectives of this program are. You have to ask yourself, are you a fit for what we're trying to do here? So these are all good questions, and I'm glad you're asking.
I want to clarify on something that I said previously about kind of having disjointed, sections to your portfolio. I think a lot of that is framing. I think a lot of it is it takes time to identify, what your unique lens is as a person, as a designer, as an engineer, as an interdisciplinary superstar. So I think that it's more about what I mean is kind of the flow of those things of saying, I'm an engineer, whatever. I also have done these, public art projects that, address this community, blah, 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 tying that together, and kind of rather than just saying, I'm a hardcore engineer, and then also here's this artwork I did, not sure if it really fits, but conveying, you know, I'm an engineer with a passion for design, and you can see where my core competencies are, and then I'm working on this other, these other projects that really keep me up at night and are really, I'm passionate about, and you know, by coming to the MADE program, I can leverage what I'm really good at and kind of, continue to excel and build these skills and help, designers who want to learn engineering, we can cross pollinate with each other. I think it's about conveying that narrative through your work, and not just making it, because that could be the exact same images, the exact same projects, but it's just about how you show us who you are. So I think it's a framing thing rather than, I don't want to discourage people from including information that they're not, is not their core competency. I think it's just a matter of narrative.
About the physical prototyping question, I think it would be both, right? We'd love to see your prototyping skills in relation to a problem that you solved. So if you can be descriptive of that, you get a twofer for us to look at.
Yeah. Hardware project manager. I work with designers and engineers. Yep. Sorry, Rich.
No, I would say a different way to ask the same question is future paths. Yes. If you're an A+ student, everything we teach come anyway. We need the help. You can teach from the student seat, but the reality is, in all practice, you're gonna have gaps, and that's what we're here to do, is to help fill those gaps.
Chanel. I'm a hardware project manager. I work with designers and engineers, but I don't actually do either. Should my recommenders be looking purely at how I perform at design engineering? Can they speak to my existing skill set? I think speak to your existing skill set. Yeah, speak to your,
what you do well.
Yeah, how you facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration. That's a pretty awesome recommendation.
Victoria and Tori, what's the PDF size? I can't remember.
I just added a link to all of the portfolio guidelines, the PDF of like the full scope of portfolio guidelines, into the chat and sent it to everyone. So you should be able to find everything in there, including like the number of projects we're looking for, the pages. So all of that could be found in one spot. And of course, we'll also follow up with the recording of the session.
Great. Okay, one left.
I have a strong background in biomedical engineering, but I want to transition into something else through this program. I'm not sure exactly what that will be, other than I want to lean more into the design space. Do you think this program is a good way to explore future paths, express that in the application, or is it best for me to come in with a more strong objective specific field you want to work in? To be honest with you, Mackenzie, I would think critically about, if you were to have, 11 months to work on 3-5 projects, what would those be? What is really exciting for you in the design space? And if you're not sure what that is right now, I would do some more research into different fields of design. Think about, because there absolutely are, problems that you care about so much that it bothers you when other people don't care about them. And think about, how can you apply, what could you focus on? If you were accepted, how could you hit the ground running? And I think that you absolutely, think about that critically and kind of convey that through your portfolio. I'm a biomedical engineering, and you can see some of these passions in my work. I'm interested in health tech. I want to work on design for health tech. I designed this, awesome project, but it's really rough around the edges. I want to make a slick enclosure for it. Um, yeah, I would think about that and highlight, saying this is, my biomedical project, and next steps would be collaborating with an industrial designer, um, doing human factors research. And if accepted, I want to take classes in human factors or industrial design, and push my skills so I can build those skills. I might not necessarily become an industrial designer in 11 months, but I can collaborate with industrial designers. I can walk the walk, talk the talk, and I can build those skills myself, and kind of enter into industry where I can work in collaborative teams.
Griffin, you just wrote her letter.
Yeah, you did a great job to include like I'm a biomedical engineer. I was like, no, you're not, Griffin. Listen, I hope you can sense the passion. Again, I've been trying very hard to listen. I'm usually much more of a talker, but as a maker in residence, you get Griffin, right? I mean, he comes with the package. I think you get a lot of people like Griffin. I'm going to go back to something else that I said earlier, and I know we're a little close on time. The fact that you have faculty with very, very different disciplinary perspectives, very different experiences, very different networks. There is no one flavor. I just left the Made Studio space a second ago. They just collapsed because they worked on a project. There's three of them sitting there. They're collaborating. They're thinking through what their next thing in. They're working on their spring project. I'm not saying you have to do that if you come join us, but all of this is this really cool student-driven. What do you want of it? Which is different than it's going to be uh, some type of bespoke. It's, you have a list of 50 things and we have to meet those. There's a core set of requirements. There is something that we are trying to accomplish. And then from there, you're going to get to be able to expand to mold that to your preferences, if that makes any sense. And what Griffin just described is potentially how you capture what you've done to get in. We've tried to tell you what it is that happens when you get in. And the last is whether you decide once you apply to join us or not. Ms. Tori, anything we
That was
missed?
great. Yeah.
No, that's all great.
Oh, we should stop at that was great. I like that.
That'll be where we trip.
Anonymous attendee. Is it encouraged to have a unifying theme across all project, or might it cover a diverse application to show different skills? I think this is a great point to iterate, or to highlight that iteration is really important with developing these portfolios. It's not a matter of, if you get it wrong, it's a matter of, what can be tweaked, how quickly can you tweak it. It's get everything on paper, then look at your work. I guarantee that you'll start to see some common themes emerging in the type of problems that you're passionate about, or a number of core problems that you're passionate about, but they're going to be, common threads that demonstrate who you are. And I've had this experience as well, where it feels like, I'm passionate about these disjointed things, but when you start to look at them all together, you can really clarify what your unique lens is. And that's where, it's hard to do that when it's not all, on paper in front of you, but you can start to kind of massage that narrative together. But definitely, I think having a diversity, there's a balance between showing that you're spread very thin and showing that, or not highlighting, a variety of skills or your breadth of skills. So but I think finding that narrative will make it feel more unified to you.
Ms. Tori, anything we missed?
There's a question here about how many projects do students do? And I think that's going to depend on electives, but for the core courses, it's probably 3 or 4.
I think what's important to know is you're going to end with a very big project. You're going to work your way up through that iteration curve. More is better because it's just more practice. And part of what we're trying to teach you, and you already know how to do, is to be able to receive feedback, incorporate it, ignore some of it, incorporate others, and get better. And also work with teams. You don't want all of you aren't going to have the same skill set, and it's an art. Again, this isn't a behavioral science experiment. but you're going to work with different people who have different perspectives, and that very challenging yet very rewarding ability to get people together that are just such an impressive cohort is something that you will gain sort of beyond the technical skill. I think you're going to have a cohort of people that are going to be your people that you call when you're stuck in the future, or heck, maybe on Friday. All right. I know we're very close to being out of time. I'm going to stop talking, but just thank everybody for taking the time to dig in. Miss Victoria, thank you so much. And I'll stand by and be quiet.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on the number of projects there, there's going to be, there are 4 core studio courses. There's going to be a big deliverable for each one of those, but there are also going to be smaller design sprints, design challenges, workshop assignments in each of those studios. So you'll have smaller, the iteration will kind of culminate in that large project 4 times. But there will also be smaller projects where we'll push you to submit deliverables for those. Guidelines sound like it's a statement of purpose. As a personal statement meant to be illustrating who you are as a person. I think those are more one and the same than you're presenting.
We also have a
I
series of
think,
short answer questions that we're asking
yeah.
in the application. So like I was saying earlier, we're going to ask you for really specific answers to those questions, which is very different from what we're asking for in the portfolio. Right, Griffin?
Yeah, I think it'll kind of, as you look at the questions, the short answer questions, I think you can kind of start to see how to not kind of repeat yourself too much, where there might be things that you can convey in one of those questions where you don't need to go into that in the personal statement, but really kind of highlight your, who you are as a person or professional, what your unique lens is as a professional. That may be what you do right now. That may be what you're hoping to focus on in the future. And that's kind of your purpose in this scenario would be kind of getting from point A to point B, and you kind of what you can achieve in your time with MAID.
So those are all the questions. It's right at 1 o'clock. Thank you everybody so much for joining us. And thank you so much for the wonderful panel of folks from design engineering. Great to hear from you as always. We hope to see your applications soon. I put my email address in the chat. If anybody needs to be connected with any of the folks on the call, I'm more than happy to facilitate that. So please feel free to reach out to me. All right.
Bye,
Thanks,
friends.
everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Bye, everyone.